This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, joined by Dr. George Szamuely and Martin J. And having had their input on the Olympics and some very valid points about Russia, let's have a look at what the current situation is, because Ukraine has launched an attack on the Kursk region in what is the largest assault on Russian territory since the outbreak of the conflict. George, what's your take on all of this?
Well, at this stage, we know very little about the true state of affairs in Kursk, because neither the Russian government nor the Ukrainian government is revealing very much about the state of play. This was obviously a major onslaught involving probably at least thousands of armed men, armored vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, missiles, drones, air power. So today is the seventh day, and the Ukrainians seem to be still dug in. How much territory they've taken is unclear, but it's maybe about 20 square. I mean, they're probably about 20 kilometers inside Kursk. How much territory they're actually in control of is unclear. So this is a real problem for Russia. I mean, it's a psychological problem, obviously, because they left their border undefended, even though they'd seen the previous attacks on the Belgorod region earlier in this year. But those were conducted by Russians, obviously under Ukrainian sponsorship. This is actually Ukrainian armed forces. So Russia's going to have a job pushing them out. I mean, I think Russia will push them out, but it's not going to be easy. The Ukrainians have learned to be very tough fighters. But there's other things going on. There's a crisis there going on between Ukraine and Belarus. That could certainly explode. And if some fighting takes place between Ukraine and Belarus, Russia will be forced to divert its forces. I mean, so far, Russians haven't diverted their forces from the Donbass into Kursk. That may change, but at the moment, it seems that they're still fighting and that they're only using conscripts in order to drive, the conscripts were based in Russia to drive out the Ukrainians. But if fighting breaks out between the Ukraine and Belarus, then I think Russia will be forced to take some of their forces out from the Donbass. And that would be quite a serious then issue, because that really does escalate the war if Belarus is involved. And then, of course, we have the events at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Ukraine, obviously, it was Ukraine that attacked the power plant. The International Atomic Energy Authority has more or less confirmed that it was an attack, and it doesn't make any sense for Russia to attack its own plant when they have Russians who are stationed at the plant. So things could be bubbling along into quite a serious crisis in the next few days.
It is worrying, isn't it? I mean, you're having a look at the sort of optics on this, and I was looking at Zelensky's post, and his sort of he often posts on X, as it now is. He says currently radiation levels are within norm. However, as long as the Russian terrorists maintain control over the nuclear power, the situation is not and cannot be normal. Since the first day of the seizure, Russia has been using the plant only to blackmail Ukraine, all of Europe and the world. We're waiting for the world to react, waiting for the IAEA to react. Russia must be held accountable for this. What's your take on that, Martin?
Yeah, he would say that, wouldn't he? There's no evidence of that at all. Nothing. The idea that Russia is holding up this nuclear power plant as some sort of master play, which it will play at some point, is that's ludicrous. From day one, journalists have always had their eye on this plant, and I think. I think a couple of weeks ago, I said on your show that sooner or later, Zelensky are going to fire a couple of rockets at it, strike a lucky hit, and then they will be feeding the media with stories of, look what Russia's doing. It's actually planning to blow up its own power plant, to cause wide-scale environmental degradation, as well as even the threat to lives. It was inevitable that this was going to happen sooner or later. And I think the key thing here for me is 2 weeks ago, Zelensky had a phone call with Trump. And for me, that changes now the prism of how we interpret all news that comes from the Ukraine war, because basically Zelensky and his cabal are preparing for a Trump victory, and Trump has made it very, very clear that he's going to play very hard ball with Zelensky over the territories in Donetsk and Luhansk, territories that are taken by Russia, but there's a small part of it which is being held by the Ukrainians as well. And Trump has made it very clear you're going to have to give up either the territory that you already have in those areas and let Russia keep the rest, or give up the whole of those two key territories, which are Russian-speaking. You know, it's not clear which, but he's signaled until now that he wouldn't do that. Those territories are off limits. And so the way we can look at this invasion into the Russian side is, I think, quite a masterly plan, a very bold plan, and we can say in the short term, quite successful. You know, we can salute the Ukrainian army for seeing a weak spot and going for it, but that's not the test. The test is whether they can hold it. You know, and that's a really bigger question now. You know, does, as George points out, does Putin move troops from Donbass or other areas into this new location, or does he allow the Ukrainians to take vacation of it, you know, to hold it, which will absorb a number of troops, number of bits of hardware, which could be used elsewhere in the war? And does he plan on himself looking for pockets of points of weakness, you know, where he can actually play a hand back, you know, to also play the media game? Because I think that's what really this is. I think this is a media game. And I think Zelensky is now thinking, if Trump gets in November and plays hardball, I need all of the aces in my pack to play so that there is some negotiation on my side, that I have something. At the moment, it looks like analysts look at the negotiation, the possible negotiation, and they say, well, there's nothing the Ukrainians have got. You know, Russia basically holds all the aces. You know, the only thing you could play is you could guarantee never to join NATO. You could guarantee to maybe clean up a bit the far right extremist groups you've got. But when you talk about these regions, you know, it starts to get much more complicated. So I think it's not just a military play. It's not just a military coup that he's pulled off. I think it's also about the possible negotiations that might be coming in the longer term. And, you know, he may well be hoping that Russia sends troops from other posts. You know, there is another key part of that borderline, which is a couple of 100 miles away, where Russia recently took villages on the Ukraine.
Oh, I can't hear you. For some reason, I can no longer hear you. Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. You seem to be breaking up. We lost you for a little bit there. I don't know if you can still hear me. But you make some very interesting points about Trump's involvement with all of this. And Trump is due to give an interview with Elon Musk later today. He's also due back on X, as it now is called. And you might recall that the last time he was on X, there was this glorious shot of him here, which is a long time, when he basically capitalized on the mugshot that he had when he was arrested. Mugshot, August 24th, 2023, election interference, never surrender, DonaldTrump.com. And you might recall that he raised millions as a result of it. But his role in how this is going to affect the war between Ukraine and Russia is quite interesting. Do you share Martin's opinion, George?
Not entirely. I mean, it's possible that Zelensky is thinking along those lines. But in the first place, it's by no means clear that Trump will win. It may have been clear a month ago when Biden was still the Democratic Party would-be nominee, that Trump will win. Trump was comfortably ahead in the polls. So, you know, he's now basically, at least it's drawn level with Kamala Harris. So it's not at all clear that he will win. The other thing is that I don't think Trump has exactly thought out how he's going to bring this to an end. I'm not at all sure that that's, his line will be where you have to give up territory to Russia. That may be Viktor Orban, who has had conversations with him. Viktor Orban has interpreted what Trump is saying, because Trump is someone who tells people what they want to hear. And I think Orban wanted to hear that. And so, Trump seemed to suggest to him that that would be his goal. But nonetheless, the things that Trump is saying, he's saying that, hey, I did the most for Ukraine to be able to fight off Russia. And the people who would be part of the Trump team, and they've all spoken out. They've written articles in Foreign Affairs. There are people who, from the America First Policy Institute. They're all kind of saying that, what Trump would do is continue the war, but shift some of the burden onto the Europeans, so that somehow the Europeans should do more of the heavy lifting. Now, all I'm saying is that it's not at all clear which way Trump's going to go. I'm not saying Trump is going to escalate the war, though it's possible, or that Trump will bring it to an end, which is also possible. So I don't really know. I think it's much more on the part of Zelensky to inflict a certain level of pain and humiliation on Russia. Because at the moment, Russia hasn't taken out any of the forces from the Donbass. The fighters in the Donbass, those are battle-hardened, and they're good, experienced fighters. So obviously it would make sense for Russia to take them out to take care of this problem in Kursk. Instead, Russia is likely to use conscripts. Well, the problem with using conscripts is that they are not battle-hardened, they're inexperienced, and they're likely to suffer heavy casualties. This has already happened. There was a convoy that was sent to Kursk towards the end of last week, and that was obviously, it was just obliterated. So there were already severe casualties. I think Zelensky is figuring that Russia will come to the conclusion that it cannot win this war at this snail's pace, at this sort of special military operation, and that Russia will be forced to introduce mobilization. And then he thinks that Putin's going to have some serious political problems. And he's kind of hinted at this, and that's his calculation, that Russia has been reluctant up until now to order a full mobilization. For all the talk of this is existential and so on, it's only been a partial mobilization. But what happens if Russia undertakes a full mobilization? I mean, Russia at the moment is patriotic and supports Putin, but who knows what happens if it's a full mobilization? That's, I think, is Zelensky's calculation, and I think that's why he's also trying to stir up problems in Belarus, because again, that's going to force Russia to help out his friend Lukashenko. And there's still another fly in the ointment, which is what happens if there's trouble in Moldova with Transnistria. Russia has no border with Moldova, so if the Transnistrians, where ethnic Russians are under attack, again, Russia has to do something, and it's going to be very, very difficult given that it doesn't have a border with Moldova. So I think, Zelensky is kind of juggling a lot of balls in the air, trying to put pressure on Russia.
Yeah, I mean, you make some excellent points. I mean, social media is going into meltdown when we talk about Ukraine, saying it's a proxy war and so on and so forth. Eleanor makes a good point about the Olympics as well, saying that was basically a distraction for 2+ weeks to get the eyes off Gaza and Ukraine and so on and so forth. Is that a fair summary, do you think, Martin? I can't hear Martin for some reason. Can we hear Martin? Are you still there?
Hear me now. Can you hear me now?
Okay, so there we go. I think that little mute button, or you've got to go petting Max or whatever. Can you hear us now? He's back with
question
us.
About the Olympics. I thought we would stay with Kurt.
No, we're definitely staying. It's basically Eleanor was sort of saying that it's been a distraction, and whilst people are doing that, a lot of people are sort of turning around and saying actually a proxy war is what's happening for NATO and that sort of side. What's your take on that?
That's the risk. I mean, that's the big risk that he's playing. You know, we've had this game of chicken, if you want to call it that, of always cranking up the stakes, escalation, which NATO have played very well. They've always assumed that no matter how far you push Putin will not want to engage in a real full-on war with NATO outside of the boundaries of Ukraine. But I wonder how far you can take that game, because if Zelensky, if we can give him the credit for being so smart as to go into Kursk and to take this particular region, and maybe even go for a second one, who knows, in the coming weeks, the pressure on Putin is very, very high. You have to remember that when Putin went into Ukraine, initially people thought that it would be nothing. The Russians were not imagining that this regional problem with Ukraine would actually spill over into Russia. And so now, the headlines that are in Russian media now, which Putin really didn't imagine could have come about, which is that now Ukraine is actually threatening Russians, and Russian people are being killed, and Russian people are having to move out of their homes and their regions. That is really putting pressure on Putin, because he knows that he has to do something about that very quickly. The worry is, from a Western geomilitary perspective, the worry is that he reaches a breaking point and his patience snaps and he decides, okay, now I've had enough. Now this is now going to be a regional war. You're hitting my people outside of Ukraine, then why shouldn't I hit military installations in Poland, for example? Isn't that fair game? And then what does NATO do? I'm absolutely certain NATO would then have to back down, because NATO does not have the political clout, the courage, the verve at all for a full-out war. But it's very interesting that, in the last few days we're hearing in tandem to the Kursk invasion, if we can call it that, we're also hearing more and more about F-16s buzzing around all over the place now. Further down the south, there were reports yesterday of a couple, and I'm just wondering how that can possibly be, given that you need to take pilots and give them minimum 6 months training on the F-16s, minimum 6 months. So these F-16s have been delivered in the last few weeks from the Netherlands. They're old generation planes, but if we're going to see more of those in the skies, and Zelensky is thinking of using air power now to take more regions, to punch little pocket holes, in the perimeter, then I can tell you we are moving into a really, really dangerous zone now. And it's no longer going to be called a proxy war if things start to get out of control. So we cannot really call this a victory so far. It's an interesting battle that he's won briefly, but I think we need to judge how Putin reacts in the next few days, whether he can actually sustain that small pocket or whether he will be forced to eliminate it. And then what? Then Zelensky looks even more stupid and more weak and more confused as ever.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we've made this point before here on the Muckrakers that a lot of the weapons being supplied, a lot of the F-16s and so on and so forth, it takes not just months, sometimes years to train up properly on them. So the only way you can do that is to supply a pilot as well. In the case of the F-16s, what's your take on that, George?
No, I think it is a very dangerous situation. So, but if there are Western pilots, I think there probably are, they are probably not active servicemen. They're probably just mercenaries, recently retired from the armed forces. That would give the NATO powers a certain plausible deniability. Well, we're not actually directly involved. These are people who have retired. They've taken some cash and are doing it. But there's no question that there will be a point at which Russia will say enough is enough. I think that probably that's something that Russia should have taken really some time ago, because it was obvious that this is how NATO was going to play it, that they were going to say, well, they were pushing and pushing and pushing. And every time you pointed out, you say, you're facilitating the war. They say, no, we're not, we're not a participant in this conflict. We're not a party to this conflict. And this is how they've been getting away with it. It's very interesting how deceitful the Americans have been. Because remember when, for the first time, the Biden administration, I think it was in May, said, yeah, you can use American weapons in Russian territory, but only as part of this operation to defend Kharkov. So you can attack Russian armed formations attacking Kharkov. Then they changed that and said, well, yeah, you can use American weaponry on Russian territory in anticipation of any Russian attacks on Ukraine. But now, basically, they were asked, the White House was actually asked, hey, you're using American weaponry in Kursk. Is that the Biden administration policy? Yes, again, no, there's been no change in policy. So now they're pretty much saying, yeah, you can do that. But they're still going to insist, well, we're not a party to the conflict. And then we get to the point where it may be that Russia should just simply say, all right, fine, we're going to start hitting targets maybe in Poland or Romania. And then you put it to NATO and say, all right, then what are you going to do about it? I mean, you talk about Article 5. Are you really ready to go to war? Because this has been a nice little holiday for you. You send the weapons, let others get killed, and then you scream, hey, we're not in this. We're not a party to the conflict. So now you say, all right, are you ready now to be a party to the conflict? And then we'll see. I mean, I tend to agree with Martin. I don't think they are ready to be an active party to the conflict, but it's probably the most effective way of bringing this war to an end.